Well, good evening to all. My name is John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out this evening. If you would, in honor of our men and women in uniform who serve our cause around the world, please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. Yeah, play ball. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to recognize one person in particular in the audience. His name is Ben Sutton, and Ben is one of our Board of Trustee members at the Foundation. Ben, thanks for coming. You know, no matter how practiced one might feel they are at introducing a famous or important person, it's often not easy, at least not for me. I think one is called on to do their very best and to go beyond a simple reading of an impressive resume when a guest has gone out of their way and spent their lifetime in the realm of public service and performed magnificently for the American people. I think they need to be lauded, thanked, and actually introduced in a thoughtful way. So that was the challenge that I faced as I once again sat down and prepared to write an introduction of both Vice President Cheney and his accomplished daughter, Liz. For those of you who follow events at the Reagan Library, you know that quite well, that both of our guests have been here before. So what to do to impress upon an audience once again that our visitors are something special? Well, one theory holds forth that if you've introduced someone before and you think it went just fine, well, stick with it. Or, in other words, take the lazy, easy way out. And thanks to the miracle of modern technology, I plan to do just that. I am sure that for the more than 1,000 of you gathered here this evening, it is indeed special. And that is because tonight we are in the presence of another true American hero, Vice President Cheney and Liz. Welcome to the Reagan Library. But here is another more modern definition, one that I know both his family and millions of people in this country would easily embrace. Hero, a man of distinguished courage or ability, admired for his brave deeds and noble qualities. I like that one. But in all honesty, it does not do the man justice. How do you define someone who has quite literally dedicated his entire life to his country? Someone who has faithfully served 5 presidents and in the process has selflessly come to the aid of our country in times of great crisis. Now, if any of you are counting, that's 4 presidents I've listed, not 5, as I previously noted. The 5th that Vice President Cheney served with great honor, perhaps not directly, but certainly with great honor, and without hesitation, was Ronald Reagan. First as a foot soldier during his time in Congress, and then as a member of the Intelligence Committee and Deputy Minority Leader of the House, Representative Dick Cheney of Wyoming was a critical and respected player on Capitol Hill who helped make President Reagan's legislative program, indeed the Reagan Revolution, a reality. Okay, not bad. And he's lost a few pounds, that's good to see. But I want to say that every word of that introduction remains both timely and true. But what's new and what's exciting about their visit today is that they are here with a new book entitled Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America. Now, I don't know if the idea for their book has had its origin in the striking opinion piece they wrote for the Wall Street Journal that was published last year, but to me it certainly seems it. They wrote then that the Obama foreign policy doctrine, that of
trying to lead the world from behind was in a state of collapse, and the ramifications for America were dire. Their book, just published, expands on that theme in great detail, and it is a must-read not only for those following the events on the campaign trail of 2016, but I am hopeful that it will also become assigned reading in history classes for decades to come, because that's what it is, historical evidence that American exceptionalism that President Reagan helped to define and defend has been under attack by President Obama and his administration for years. It has been an assault that is quite simply leading to the undoing of America's stature and position in the world. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me please ask you to join me in welcoming to the stage Vice President Dick Cheney and former Assistant Secretary of State, Liz Cheney. Thank you so much. Vice President, knock it out of the park.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real joy and an honor for us to be able to be back at the Reagan Library. And as John mentioned, the whole concept of American exceptionalism is one that President Reagan wouldn't have even questioned. And in many ways, we were very inspired by President Reagan, by the things he did and said, both during his presidency and before. And his notion that it was critically important that the United States lead the world, his understanding that without us, there was no one who would step in. His rejection of ideals and ideas of moral equivalence were at the forefront. And you'll see when you buy our book, which I hope you'll do, that we open the book. The quote that leads the whole thing is by President Ronald Reagan. On March 23rd of 1983, he said, "It is up to us in our time to choose, and choose wisely, between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best, while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day." We are again, as we sit here tonight, at another moment like that, at a moment when the nation is under tremendous threat, and when we've got to decide. It can sometimes be very easy to sort of say, you know what, things are such a mess, Washington is such a mess, I'm just going to try to sort of live my life and focus on what's happening very close to me here at home, and try to sort of shut out the fights and the debates that are going on. And one of the reasons we wrote this book was to urge that people not do that, and to make the point that the fate of the Republic depends upon people not doing that. British historian Andrew Roberts once said, to the question of whether America was born great, achieved greatness, or had greatness thrust upon her, the only possible conclusion must be all three. That we were born of this revolutionary ideal, that we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that made us a model for others around the world. And then during World War II, we became freedom's defender, and that's where we begin the book, talking about the role America has played beginning really in 1939 in defending freedom around the world. At the end of the Cold War, because of the leadership of President Ronald Reagan, in large part, we became the world's sole superpower. And it's not just our involvement in world affairs that's made the difference. It's our leadership, our willingness to lead. And my dad and I felt very strongly that when you talk to your kids, my kids and his grandkids, about what they're learning in school, this isn't what they're learning. They're not learning that America has been a greater force for good than any other nation in the history of mankind. They're not learning that because of us, hundreds of millions of people around the world for decades have lived in freedom. And we wanted to not just talk about where we are today, although that's a critically important part of the book, but we wanted to put it into historical context and to talk about the truth about America and what we did in World War II and in the Cold War and in the first years of the War on Terror. Ronald Reagan said, if we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. And we were very much inspired by that and by the idea that our kids have to have a place they can go to understand the reality of what America has accomplished. And one of the great blessings for me was being able to work on this book with my dad, who, along with my mom, gave Mary and me the tremendous blessing as kids of learning to love history and learning to love this great nation. And somebody who obviously has been involved as a participant in many of the events in the book, not as far back as 1939, but close. And so I'd like to start tonight by getting your impressions. You know, when people talk about President Obama, for example, one of the things that we did was sort of go back and look at the context of this president and talk about the extent to which you think, where does he fall in sort of the spectrum of Democratic and Republican presidents, and how do his policies fit sort of what's come before, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle.
Okay, that's a good introduction. Very good. Now, I've racked my brain trying to understand why President Reagan operates the way he does.
President
and
Obama.
Of course, President Obama operates the way he does. And I think back and reflect on it. I was welcoming the way you are for a new president, even though I didn't vote for him, worked for the other guy. I'm a Republican, a conservative, and he was viewed as a liberal Democrat. But I was deeply disturbed about 48 hours into his administration when he announced that he was going to close Guantanamo and they were going to investigate and possibly prosecute the career professionals who'd carried out our counterterrorism program out of the CIA, that had run the program in terms of the National Security Agency, our ability to be able to intercept communications between Al-Qaeda overseas and their contacts in the U.S., or what we called the Enhanced Interrogation Program that we'd set up back in the aftermath of 9/11. These people who carried out the instructions of the President of the United States, programs that have been approved by the National Security Council, been signed off on by the Justice Department, and we'd done by the books from a legal standpoint, a constitutional standpoint, etc. He wants to go have those people investigated and arrested. And I thought that was, an outrageous proposition from the standpoint of, I understood he won the election, he gets to put his policies in place, and but what I did not understand, that he was prepared, for example, to prosecute people, men and women who were patriots, who put their lives on the line all the time on behalf of all the rest of us. And it was just one of the things he came to office he was going to do. I found that deeply disturbing. It raised questions in my mind about why that would sort of be some of his first things that he wanted to do once he got into office. As I thought back about it, and we spent a lot of time, I read a lot of history, and especially interested in World War II history, and my own dad served in the Navy in those years. I'm sure a lot of you got exactly that same kind of family background. But as I thought about it, I thought about the fact that there has been, I think, over the decades, for 70-some years, basically a bipartisan consensus between Republican and Democrat alike on the proposition of the U.S. role in the world, the need for a significant military capability, the willingness on occasion to use it when necessary, and that included people like FDR in World War II, or Harry Truman, who took over in unbelievable circumstances at the end of the war and then on into the Cold War, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, Jack Kennedy. I mean, there was a consensus there, basically broad outlines. They didn't always agree on everything, and there were differences between the parties oftentimes at election time. But Barack Obama was clear outside that basic consensus that, in my opinion, based on my reading and study of history, fundamentally disagreed, was not in accord, if you will, with what I think is that bipartisan accord about the U.S. role in the world that I think has dominated our history and our policies and our actions over that period of time. And that's partly what stimulated our thinking about the book. But if you look at the book and go through, I think you'll find we've documented very carefully where we believe that he has in fact done things that are not the way it would have been done if it had been done by earlier presidents. He's outside the mainstream, if you will, of presidential leadership, and even raising questions about how big a role the U.S. ought to play in the world, and that his policies over the course of the last, 6 going on 7 years now, are remarkably at odds with our history, with what we believe as a nation, and with what we're going to have to be able to do going forward if we're going to get through a very bad patch and get things back on the right course.
In 1983, President Reagan gave a famous speech from the Oval Office. And in a large part of the speech, he talked about defense spending. And he laid out the way defense budgets ought to be put together, and explained that it's critically important that the nation decide first what are the threats they've got to meet, and then allocate the resources to it. And one of the issues that we talk about in the book, and we've got a set of recommendations at the end, is this issue of our defense budget. And it's an issue that we've heard some of the candidates talk about in this election cycle, but I don't think it's gotten enough attention. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that, about the extent to which we've got to make a real change in that regard.
Sure. Well, I'm oftentimes asked what job I liked most. Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Congressman from Wyoming, Chief of Staff for Jerry Ford. All of them had something to appeal to them. I loved all aspects of my career. I was very fortunate to be able to do that. But my favorite job, the one that stood out, was being Secretary of Defense, especially during Desert Storm and the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. It was a high point, certainly in my career. But I came away with that with a deep regard for our military, for what we had to do to run the department on a reasonable basis, an understanding of why, in my view, that the role of Commander-in-Chief is the single most important responsibility by any president, more important than anything else we do. Build highways, grow food. You can think of all the various things the federal government gets involved in, but that is, in my opinion, the single most important responsibility of the President of the United States. It just is. And I also became very much aware of, and I don't want to get tangled up in a lot of detailed arguments about the budget, but one of the most important things is the length of time it takes to change course when you have to do that. If you inherit a mess as President of the United States, you can't write a check, turn the thing around overnight, and take off in the direction you want to go in. It doesn't work that way. I was tremendously impressed, frankly, and it involved Ronald Reagan. When I got to be Secretary of Defense, and then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, that first weekend of the crisis, the President sent me over to get the Egyptian and Saudi sign-off for us to begin to deploy forces. And we went through all of that, and we were able to deploy in relatively short order over 500,000 men and women halfway around the world, and produce what ultimately became Desert Storm, one of the most successful military operations in the nation's history. But as I thought back on that, we were blessed because Ronald Reagan had been president 10 years before, because he believed in a strong America. He believed in a strong military. He gave us the quantities we needed of absolutely first-rate people who had been attracted to service, been through the mill in terms of training, the F-15 fighters, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the M1A1 Abrams tank, all of those things that he had been so much a part of starting or continuing in his administration. That's what we used to win in Desert Storm in remarkable order 10 years later. First thing I did after Desert Storm was over with, I called President Reagan. He was then retired, living in Beverly Hills, and I thanked him for, when I first got him on the phone, I thanked him for all those $600 toilet seats. He said, Dick, they didn't cost $600. Yes, sir, Mr. President, I understand. But at one point during the welcome home ceremonies for all the troops in the spring of '91, after Desert Storm was over with, I had the opportunity to go visit President and Mrs. Reagan at their home down there in I guess it's Bel Air, and spent a couple hours with the president that afternoon. He was still doing pretty well health-wise, and he was intensely interested on all aspects of Desert Storm, also our relationship with the Soviets, things he'd been involved in as president. And I can remember he sat me down in a chair like this one, and then he pulled a footstool over in front of me, and he sat on the footstool facing me directly and focused right on my face and started asking me questions. And I think part of it was an effort on his part to compensate for some of the memory problems he was beginning to deal with. But he's kept me there for about 2 hours grilling me on what we were going to do. And I thanked him profusely for everything he'd done, because he was directly responsible for what we were able to do 10 years later. Now I think about going forward with what Barack Obama has done. The military is in terrible shape today. We just had the Army Chief of Staff just retired, a man named Ray Odierno, superb soldier. He was a major commander for us when we did the surge. General Petraeus was involved. Ray was the guy who actually operated on the ground and delivered on the surge in '07 and '08 that was enormously successful. He commanded for a significant period of time over there. But Ray made a speech here, a testimony before the Congress within the last 6 months. He's just retired. He said that in terms of the readiness level of the United States Army, that the Army readiness level today is worse than it has been any time in the history of the United States Army. That goes back 200 years. The Air Force Chief of Staff has announced that we're now operating the Air Force with fewer aircraft and older aircraft than any other time in our history since the Air Force was set up, and of course that was right after World War II. All of the chiefs, the current crop, as well as some of them are just retired, but in the last year have given testimony in Congress that given the current state of affairs, readiness and so forth, that they're not capable in a crisis probably of being able to execute the national strategy that the military is called upon to do. Military is in terrible shape. We have not had a budget prepared the normal way, where you look at potential threats around the world, you decide what you need to meet those threats, you put together a budget and goes through the process at the White House and on the Hill of getting it appropriated. Now we've got a thing called the sequester. This is a result of the Budget Act of 2011. And what it does, it was adopted because it's so egregious in terms of its impact. The assumption on the part of the Congress when they passed it was, we'll never live with this, but this is so bad and it's going to impose so much pain that we'll come up with a better solution. Well, they've never come up with a better solution. And now we have the sequester, and it kicks in across the board, MEDAC's approach to all of the spending accounts, but it hits the military harder than anybody else. Defense Department accounts for about 17% of the budget, takes 50% of the hits. We're now to the point where there's very, very serious question about how well we perform in a crisis, about our capacity to meet the threats that we see out around the world because of what's happened to the United States military during the Obama era. And it's a huge, huge concern to me, and in our recommendations in our book, that's sort of number one in terms of an agenda for the next administration and what they need to focus on and worry about.
As we were finishing our book, the agreement on the Iran nuclear deal was announced. And so we have a section in the book that analyzes the agreement and some recommendations about it. You gave a major speech yesterday in Washington. One of the things that you talked about in the speech was the extent to which some of the concessions that were made at the end have the potential to be devastating. You talked about the lifting of the restrictions on the ICBM program as giving the Iranians the ability to launch a nuclear attack on the U.S. homeland. It's a very direct and tough criticism of the deal. Obviously, the administration is out there making claims about it. I'd like to hear you talk about sort of the issues and the concerns that you have with the deal, and particularly what you think about some of the claims the administration's made just in the last few days.
Well, it was intriguing. I gave this speech at the American Enterprise Institute yesterday. It had been scheduled for a couple of months. And the White House response was to put up on their website basically an attack on me that was personal more than policy. They didn't answer any of the policy questions that we've raised or the people have raised about that. And I don't mind getting attacked. It goes with being vice president. I mean, you know, if I wanted to be popular and well-loved, I'd come to California and be a movie star. I wouldn't be vice president. But no, it's a terrible deal, and in so many different ways. One is the president has made a lot of claims for it, but his claims are not valid. He gets into the whole area that this will stop proliferation of nuclear weapons. No, it won't. Once the Iranians have nuclear capability, even before that, others in the region are going to want theirs. They're not going to have all those countries, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and so forth, Israelis, aren't going to sit tight and allow the Iranians to be the only ones in the neighborhood with the nuclear weapons. They will go acquire their own, and some of them certainly have the money to be able to buy them. And we've had proliferation problems in the Middle East before, but there's no doubt in my mind but what this agreement will precipitate, the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the area. The part of the frustration is that at the very end of the negotiations, all through the negotiations, we were told, well, this is just about the nuclear question. It's not about terrorism. It's not about what Iran does to support Hezbollah and Hamas and terrorist organizations. It's not about ballistic missiles, they said. It's not about conventional weapons, non-nuclear conventional weapons. But it turns out that when they finally did the deal, it was about all those things. And Obama put all those on the table at the tail end of the negotiations. So as Liz mentioned, the embargo on ballistic missiles, or doing business in ballistic missiles with Iran, has been lifted a few years down the road. Same thing for the approach on conventional weapons. But since the agreement was signed earlier this year, Soleimani, who's the general who commands the Quds Force, the worst of the worst in terms of an evil proxy, if you will, for the Iranians that have been deeply involved. One of their key activities in recent years has been building the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices used against our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. But those other related issues now are all on the table. They've been lifted, the sanctions that had been imposed on Quds Force and IRGC. Soleimani has already been to Moscow since the agreement was initialed a couple months ago, been to Moscow to buy S-300s. An S-300 is a very, very capable Russian-built anti-aircraft missile. He's already over there, even though supposedly those restrictions remain in place for 5 more years. They aren't paying any attention to him. He's already been to Moscow doing a deal with Putin. So if you go through the sequence, and I don't want to take up the whole night talking about
it's yours.
about the problem, but one of the keys has been in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed back in about 1970, in which 190 countries, virtually every country on the face of the earth, has signed up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Distinguishes between nuclear weapon states, the U.S., Britain, Russia, China, and France. They're the guys that all have weapons and can enrich uranium. And the non-weapon states, which is everybody else, including the Iranians, signed up in there, for example, not to enrich. The Iranians have demanded, as part of this agreement, that they be allowed to enrich and that we sanction their right to enrich uranium, even though it violates the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970. It also tears up the 6 UN Security Council resolutions that were adopted over the years, 5 of them promoted by the US, 3 of them that went through on unanimous votes. All of those 6 basically are targeted on the Iranians because of their bad behavior, especially with respect to uranium enrichment. The agreement that Obama signed wipes out those 6 UN Security Council resolutions. They're now zeroed out, and we've sanctioned the ability of the Iranians to have enrichment capability. They're now the only ones under the NPT that are doing that. It's a direct violation of the NPT. But all of that's just been ignored and thrown out the window. So as you go through the process and think about it and look at what's been done here, I think the outcome is bleak. I think it's a terrible direction to go down. I think we had done a lot of work over the years with respect to trying to avoid the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I think the President has put in place now an agreement that is bound and determined to create enormous pressures for the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, and that we're going to have to live with all of that in the future.
You know, I think another point or a way to sort of sum up how people should think about the agreement, you know, sometimes when you hear the President say, look, it's better than nothing. And remember, this is the man who's been telling us he won't accept a bad deal. And now he's saying, well, this bad deal is better than no deal. And it seems to me it's important to remember, number one, it won't accomplish what he says with respect to the nuclear weapons. For a number of reasons my dad listed, also because the inspections regime is, you know, Swiss cheese. It's absolutely full of holes. It will not enable us to have any sort of understanding, in-depth understanding of what the Iranians are doing. It won't enable us to catch them if they want to cheat. It's been amazing to see John Kerry saying, we will know with certainty what the Iranians are doing. We certainly won't. So it won't prevent them from having nuclear weapons. It will give them international cover and legitimacy, because suddenly you're having international business run in, suddenly they're no longer a pariah state because of this agreement. And at the same time, it gives them all of these benefits, $150 billion in cash, the lifting of the restrictions my dad mentioned. So you'll have Iran, which is sworn to destroy Israel, sworn recently to do everything it can to attack America, which chants death to America on a daily basis, now provided with funds, with weapons, and a pathway to a nuclear bomb. And when you think that you've got a president of the United States who has put all of that in place, it really is very, very difficult to understand why he would think, you know, if you'd said 10 years ago, our president is going to be providing the money and the weapons that Iran needs to attack the United States. That's exactly what this deal does, even before you get to the issue of a pathway to a nuclear weapon. It's a very dangerous deal. And it gets back to this notion of sort of the president's view of the world. And one of the things that is a theme that runs through the book that we spend a lot of time on is the extent to which you had presidents Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, you know, Nixon, Ford, Carter to a lesser extent, Reagan, understanding that weakness is provocative. This president doesn't understand that. And I think it would be interesting to hear sort of your assessment, if you look at places like Russia and China, what the impact of his unwillingness to defend red lines, to project American power, to lead in the world, what impact that's having, and where you see those relationships going in the future.
Sure. Well, we've been focused the last few days, obviously, on the Iranian situation in the Middle East. It's a huge set of problems. It gets worse. There's an Arab caliphate there, et cetera. But you also must look at Russia and look at China when we start to talk about our strategic situation, our capacity to deal with it. One of the great strengths the U.S. has had, again, going back to World War II, is we've always had a significant advantage from a technical standpoint in all of the basic technologies that you need in the military. Things like stealth aircraft or precision-guided munitions or the Abrams tank, which is still absolutely the best in the world and nobody else can beat. But that technological advantage is disappearing. And if you look carefully at what's happening in Russia and China, you will see, evidence that in fact that gap that's been a great advantage for us, nobody's been able to best us over that period of time. You begin to worry when you see what's happening. If you look at Russia, just yesterday I saw an article, the clips that I get, that the Russians now are building an undersea unmanned robot submarine that'll be able, obviously, to do all of those things underwater that we can now do with drones. Topside will be an underwater drone, and that's got all kinds of ramifications for it. But it's pictured. They've actually publicized what they're doing. If you go to China, you'll find that if you look back at their defense budgets, since 1989, there's only been 1 year when the Chinese defense budget hasn't gone up by double digits. Only one. No, we're a long way from having defense budgets going up by double digits. That doesn't happen anymore because of the sequester. The Chinese have developed a ballistic missile that'll take out a submarine. They're very concerned about our submarines. That's been a major core of our strength, especially in the Western Pacific. They know what our aircraft carriers are capable of doing, but they've got now a ballistic missile that'll take out our aircraft carriers. You can look at what they're doing in the South China Sea, where they've gone in and built man-made islands. There's some shallow reefs there, but if you look at what they're actually doing, they're building air bases on them. They're turning them into military facilities and just claiming part of the South China Sea that has obviously been international waters up till now. Look at what Putin has done in Ukraine, Crimea. I think he has aspirations of similar activity with respect to the Baltics, to Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. They were all part of the Soviet Union going back to World War II. They all have significant minority Russian populations in them. They're all 100% dependent on Russia for their natural gas supplies. And they're all members of NATO. We have solemn obligation to come to their assistance should they be attacked. The question is, could we do that? Are we capable of putting together that kind of an operation if we had to? I think Putin's bound and determined, while Obama's in the White House, to take advantage of that. He knows weakness when he sees it. It is provocative. And I think he also has as an objective the desire to undermine NATO. I can see him pursuing a strategy, a series of operations, basically, that would really put a lot of pressure on the United States. Remember, we're 75% of the NATO budget. We're the only ones. There isn't a NATO without the United States leadership and U.S. forces to be a part of it. And all of that is, I think, going to be tested in the next couple of years by Mr. Putin. He watches, he can read the newspapers, he knows what's happening to our defense budget. He obviously has a set of beliefs. Somebody suggested the other day more dangerous than the predecessors, Gorbachev's predecessors, when you had Brezhnev and others, and the argument was at least there was a Politburo there that he had to answer to. Putin doesn't have to answer to anybody. He's a one-man dictatorship with aspirations of trying to undo what he sees as the damage done by the end of the Cold War. So there's a lot of concern, both on the part of the Chinese, on our part, about the Chinese and the Russians. And both the Chinese and the Russians are working very hard to try to fill those gaps, places where we have military capability that they haven't been able to challenge previously, like a ballistic missile that can take out an aircraft carrier. And the threat that it poses to us, the weakness that we've imposed on ourselves, the anti-missile capability we were going to build in Poland and the Czech Republic that Obama threw away, closed down that part of the program. There's a long list of threats out there, but it's a multiplier. You see, one foul up, one problem, one weakness, one budget cut adds on to the other, and then they do something like move into the eastern part of the Ukraine, and what penalties been imposed? Not much. You see China moving into the South China Sea? Not much. And when the United States makes bold talk, you know, they look at Obama's approach to the Syrian Red Line when he was going to get active militarily, when Bashir Assad used gas on his own people, and then Assad did that, and Obama turned around and walked away from it. They simply, our allies and our adversaries no longer respect the United States the way they have in the past, and every day that goes by, there's just more evidence added, especially something like the Iranian nuclear deal, that really pounds home the proposition for our adversaries out there that they have nothing to fear from the United States.
Let's talk about Iraq. The video that you mentioned that the White House put up yesterday in response to your Iran speech was criticizing you for the decision to liberate Iraq in 2003. Now, my own personal view is that anybody who referred to ISIS as the JV team is not really in a position to be lecturing anyone on the topic of Iraq. But let's talk about Iraq. Your sense of what you did, why you did it, was it the right thing to do, and what other impacts it had that people may not be fully aware of?
Sure. Well, after we did Desert Storm, the question was whether or not we should go on to Baghdad then, and there was a unanimous view that we should not. There wasn't anybody urging it. What happened between that, 1991, and 2003 was a little item called 9/11, when we lost 3,000 people in the United States, saw the World Trade Towers down, big hole in the Pentagon. Would have had Flight 93 would have taken out the White House or the Capitol building if it hadn't been for the courageous passengers on board. And we had reporting in the aftermath of that bin Laden, for example, was trying to get his hands on a nuclear weapon. Remember in 9/11 where 19 guys armed with airline tickets and box cutters. That's what they had, airline tickets and box cutters, to launch that attack. And just an awful lot of evidence that the thing we had to worry about in the future was another attack like that with far deadlier weapons, bugs, gas, or nuclear venture. We had been, if you looked at the history of the world and that part of the world and this whole question of proliferation, one of the main things we really were concerned about was the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And it wasn't something that just came up on one intelligence report prior to 9/11. You go back to 1981. And Baghdad, Saddam Hussein had a nuclear reactor operating at a Syric down outside Baghdad. Israelis took it out. 1991, Saddam had restarted his nuclear program again. We took it out in Desert Storm. Then you fast forward up to 2003, and we made the judgment based on the fact that we were getting a ton of intelligence that said Saddam Hussein was again back in the nuclear business. And we went in and took down the Saddam Hussein regime. The side bag, obviously one of the things of doing that ended any threat coming immediately from Iraq, but it also had significant impact on the proliferation problem because two examples already, 81 and 91, but also what happened after we took down Saddam Hussein is Muammar Gaddafi got religion. And Gaddafi had centrifuges, he had uranium feedstock, and he had a weapons design. And when we took down Saddam Hussein, I think it was 5 days after we dug him out of his hole, Muammar Gaddafi got religion and announced he was going to turn over all his nuclear materials to the United States. And he did. Very wise man. That did a couple of things. One was, think of what would have happened in Libya in subsequent years if he had not turned over those nuclear materials to the United States. When he was finally overthrown and ISIS moved in, killed Gaddafi, the radicals did, they would have inherited that Libyan nuclear program. The second thing it did when we went in and took that back from the Libyans, then that uncovered A.Q. Khan. Mr. Khan was the Pakistani engineer who'd had a major hand in building nuclear inventory, nuclear weapons for Pakistan. And then he'd gone into business for himself, set up a black market operation, Libya was his biggest customer. But he'd also been involved with the North Koreans, with the Iranians. It turns out, if you go back to 1987, in a meeting in a hotel in Dubai, it was Khan and Khan's people who got $3 million in return for providing the basic design of centrifuges for the Iranians. So in 1987, Iranians get their start with something that came from A.Q. Khan. We shut him down. He went into house arrest in Pakistan. We shut down his black market operation. So those are all examples where we use military or the threat of military operations to halt proliferation. The other thing that happened was in 2007, Meyer Dagan showed up in my office in the West Wing, and Steve Hadley was there. He had photographs. He's head of Israeli intelligence. He had photographs taken inside the nuclear reactor built by the North Koreans for the Syrians at Al-Kabar in eastern Syria. That was 2007. The Israelis took it out, but imagine what would have happened if they hadn't taken it out. Al-Kabar now smack dab in the middle of ISIS territory, part of the caliphate that ISIS now has. That's another instance where we were very lucky and radical Islamists didn't get their hands on nuclear material. But it's only a matter of time. And I think we're safer today than we would have been if we hadn't taken down Saddam Hussein. Those who argue against it have to explain the fact that you still have Saddam Hussein around. But it was very, very important. I believe then and believe now we did the right thing in 2003, and that the world is less threatening now than it was, but Barack Obama is about to turn it on its head with his operations and the deal he wants to do with the Iranians.
ISIS, the rise of ISIS, do you think the caliphate can be contained?
I'm not sure how you contain the caliphate if you're going to withdraw U.S. forces. You can cross your fingers, you can pray, you can try to find somebody who will go in and do it for you. But I think ISIS is such a deadly combination. Caliphate is a very significant thing. It's the first time we've had one in hundreds of years where they've now established a regime, governs under Sharia law, extraordinarily radical. We've seen what they do, recruiting successfully, for example, even here in the United States. We see some of the stories of young people being encouraged to go to Syria and sign up with ISIS and to be part of that new system. A very potent, very deadly force committed to the destruction of all the infidels, now have a foothold in Libya as well. The thing I worry about is that some of the refugees now that are flowing out of Syria and into Europe, some of them may well be people operating, sub rosa, actually members of ISIS, but are trying to transfer their revolution now to Europe because there's already a significant presence of them there. So I think the only option on ISIS, I think they have to be destroyed. You're going to have to do it sooner or later. It's only going to be more costly and take longer. The longer we wait, and it's going to be especially dangerous if by the time we decide we're going to do something about it, they have a nuclear weapon. Because one of those governments over there has fallen after they've acquired that capability. And then we'll have a grave, grave difficulty, a situation where you've got great instability and unrest, terrorist in control, and they've got their hands on deadlier weapons than they've ever had before.
Let's talk about Hillary.
Why does everybody laugh?
Secretary Clinton had a very interesting approach to email as Secretary of State. And I'd like to get your thoughts both on her decision that she could conduct all of her business, including, we now know, sending top secret emails on a private server that resided in a bathroom in Denver. And what you think that says about her fitness to be Commander-in-Chief.
Well,
But it's not a trick question.
It's not a trick question.
No.
Well, I don't think she's qualified to be Commander-in-Chief, obviously. I think this question, this private server. Anybody who's been there and done through those processes, whether you're Secretary of Defense or State, part of the cabinet, dealing with classified, highly classified information all the time, you don't make mistakes like that. There's some reason why she did it, and I assume we're going to find out what it is, since they're now pretty aggressively pursuing what was on the server. And as I say, in the last couple of days, they found that there were top secret papers on that server. That's the highest classification there is, unless you get into some very specialized areas. And I don't, I'm not a Hillary fan. Okay?
That's breaking news.
Breaking news, yeah.
I'm getting the look that says, move on. As you look at 2016, I know you mentioned to me before we came in that you wanted to use the opportunity tonight to announce your endorsement.
Oh. That is a fast one. It's not part of the program. I haven't endorsed anybody yet. I know a lot of the candidates, worked with them over the years. I've consciously stayed away from endorsing anybody for a couple of reasons. One, because of the book. What I'm really concerned about, and Liz has been concerned about, is we want, with our efforts that we've made with the book, and with some continuing stuff I do on behalf of the party, I've also committed to Reince Priebus, Republican National Chairman, and Lou Eisenberg, who's our Finance Chairman. I go out and help them raise money for the Republican Party rather than for a candidate at this stage, because they've got a lot to do as well, too. But the thing that concerns me most is to make certain that these issues, the kind we've just been talking about, national security issues, are front and center in this campaign. It ought to be, if it's the most important thing a president has to do and has to worry about, it ought to be right at the top of the agenda when it comes time to make a choice about who I want to support. So I'm interested in how the various candidates will respond to our suggestions. I don't expect to be able to dictate policy at all, but those are the problems I see out there based on my 40-some years in the business. And I think the record's there for itself, that Obama's taken us down a primrose path here, and the next president, man or woman, is going to have to take on that task the day they arrive in office. And I want to make sure that I think they're up to the task. So that's sort of my number one priority.
So no endorsement tonight?
No endorsement tonight.
Sorry. It was the case that as we worked on the book, there were days, especially when we were doing the research and the writing about the Obama era, that it could be really dispiriting. And, we have a whole section on the extent to which the president traveled the world during his first year in office, literally apologizing for us and talking at every opportunity, taking every opportunity to make sure that he had conveyed to foreign governments, foreign audiences, that he believed America had been arrogant, that he believed America had not listened. He listened to a diatribe by Daniel Ortega about the lies that Ortega told about America. And the president's response was just to say, well, I'm glad he didn't blame me for things that happened when I was 3 months old. He ended his apology tour, we know, from cables that have been leaked and news reports, when he went to Japan. And before he got to Japan, the American ambassador sent a cable to Washington saying that the Japanese government had rejected the idea that President Obama travel to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and apologize for the nuclear bombs we dropped, showing no recognition at all, no understanding at all of the importance of ending the war when we ended it, and why that was the right thing to do. So it can be dispiriting, and we want to end tonight with something that's more hopeful. And that is, first I want to just read to you something that Charles Krauthammer has written, and then I'm going to end by asking my dad to read a section from the end of the prologue in the book. So we write that there is good news. Just as one president has left a path of destruction in his wake, one president can rescue us. The right person in the Oval Office can restore America's strength and our alliances, renew our power and leadership, defeat our enemies, and keep us safe. But it will not be easy. There are difficult decisions to be made and very little time. We've faced grave challenges as a nation before, and the right leaders have brought us through. As Charles Krauthammer observed, quote, "It is one of the enduring mysteries of American history, so near providential as to give the most hardened atheist pause, that it should have produced at every hinge point great men who matched the moment. A roiling revolutionary British colony gives birth to the greatest cohort of political thinkers ever. Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, Franklin, and Jay. The crisis of the 19th century brings forth Lincoln, the 20th, FDR. We're living at another hinge point of history, and we require a president equal to this moment. We must choose wisely." And now I want to ask my dad to read about another duty we have as citizens.
As citizens, we also have a duty to protect our ideals and our freedoms by safeguarding our history. We must ensure that our children know the truth about who we are, what we've done, and why it is uniquely America's duty to be freedom's defender. Our children should know about the boys of Pointe du Hoc and Doolittle's Raiders and the battles of Midway and Iwo Jima. They should learn about the courage of the young Americans who fought, light's bad. About the courage of the young Americans who fought the Nazis at the Battle of the Bulge and the Japanese on Okinawa. They should learn why America was right to end the war by dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and about the fundamental decency of a nation that established the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They need to know about the horror of the Holocaust and what it means to promise never again. They should know that once there was an empire so evil and bereft of truth, it had to build a wall to keep its citizens in, and that the free world, led by America, defeated it. They need to know about the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11, the courage of the first responders, and the heroism of the passengers on Flight 93. They should understand what kind of world militant Islam will create if we don't defeat it. They should learn about great men like George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan. We must teach them what it took to prevail over evil in the 20th century and what it will take in the 21st. We must make sure they understand that it is the brave men and women of the United States Armed Forces who defend our freedom and secure it for millions of others as well. Our children need to know that they are citizens of the most powerful, good, and honorable nation in the history of mankind, the exceptional nation. Ordinary Americans have done heroic things to guarantee her survival. America's future and the future of freedom for all the world now depend on us. Speaking at Omaha Beach on the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings, President Reagan put it this way: "We will always remember, we will always be proud, we will always be prepared, so we may always be free." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done, well done.
Thank you.
Just great.